The transport ship carrying the surviving members of the survey team rose slowly into the sky, its engines roaring against the silence of the desert below. Amara stood by a viewport, her forehead pressed lightly against the cool glass as she gazed down at the Sahara expanse one last time. From this height, the endless dunes looked almost serene, their golden waves shimmering under the sun. But Amara knew better now. The desert wasn't just sand and heat. It was alive, resilient, and deeply connected to Earth's fragile heartbeat. As the ship climbed higher, breaking through the atmosphere, the others retreated to their bunks or huddled together in quiet conversations. No one spoke much about what had happened, about Marcus and his team, swallowed by the sands, or the glowing crystals that had tested them all so mercilessly. The weight of those memories hung unspoken in the air, a shared burden none of them were ready to unpack. But Amara couldn't stop thinking about it. Her mind replayed every moment, the visions, the hum of the crystals, the storm that had spared her life. She thought about the message embedded in the shards. Earth wasn't done fighting. It was healing itself, piece by painstaking piece. And if humanity wanted to reclaim its place on this planet, they would need to earn it. Not with greed or exploitation, but with humility and care. When the ship docked at Verdantia days later, Amara felt like a stranger stepping back into her old world. The orbital habitat buzzed with activity, its lush gardens and pristine corridors a stark contrast to the harsh beauty of Earth's desert. People greeted her warmly, asking questions about her mission, eager for stories of adventure. But Amara found herself struggling to explain what she'd experienced. How could she convey the raw power of the desert, or the lessons it had taught her? Instead of diving straight back into her work, Amara began speaking out. At first, it was small gatherings, colleagues and friends curious about her findings. She showed them images of the crystals, recordings of the vibrations, and even fragments of her own notes. Slowly, word spread, drawing larger audiences until she was invited to address planetary councils and corporate boards. Earth isn't a resource, she told them during one such presentation, her voice steady despite the skepticism in the room. It's a partner. If we want to restore balance, we have to respect its boundaries and its needs. Her words sparked debate across colonies. Some dismissed her as idealistic, clinging to outdated notions of conservation. Others, however, listened. Inspired by her story, scientists began studying adaptive ecosystems like the ones Amara described. Engineers designed technologies aimed not at extraction, but at regeneration. Even corporations, wary of public backlash, started investing in sustainable practices. Months passed, and Amara became a symbol of hope, a reminder that Earth still held potential, no matter how damaged it seemed. Yet she never forgot the promise she'd made to the desert. Late at night, when the lights of Verdantia dimmed and the stars shone brightest through the observatory windows, she would pull out the shard she'd kept. Its faint glow reminded her of the bond she'd formed with the planet, and the responsibility she carried. One evening, as she prepared for another lecture, a young student approached her hesitantly. "Do you really think Earth can come back?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Amara smiled softly, holding up the shard so it caught the light. "It already is," she said, "and maybe someday, when we're ready, we'll be allowed to join it." Looking out at the crowd gathered before her, Amara felt a spark of optimism. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and setbacks. But for the first time, she believed humanity might find its way back, not as conquerors, but as stewards of a planet determined to survive. And somewhere far below, beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara expanse, the crystals pulsed faintly, waiting. Amara Solis stood at the edge of the landing platform, her heart racing, as she gazed out at the endless sea of golden sand stretching before her. This was Earth, the planet everyone in Verdantia called a soft world. It sounded poetic, didn't it? A place where life thrived effortlessly under blue skies and green forests. But now that she was here, standing on its surface, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. The air smelled dry, almost metallic, and the heat pressed against her skin like an invisible weight. She adjusted the straps of her environmental suit, trying to ignore how sticky her palms felt inside her gloves. Behind her, the rest of the survey team unloaded equipment from their shuttle. Their voices carried over the wind, sharp and efficient, but Amara barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, where dunes rolled endlessly, blending into the pale sky. There weren't any trees, no rivers, no signs of life anywhere. Just sand. So much sand. Not what you expected, huh? A voice said beside her. Amara turned to see Dr. Elias Cade, her mentor and leader of the expedition. He was older, with deep lines etched into his face and gray streaks running through his dark hair. His tone was calm, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. I thought Earth would be different, Amara admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. I mean, all those stories. Elias chuckled softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. Stories are just that. Stories. People forget Earth hasn't been soft for centuries, not since the collapse. Amara nodded, forcing herself to look away from the barren landscape. She had read the history books, of course. How rising temperatures turned fertile lands into deserts. How wars over resources stripped the planet bare. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it firsthand were two very different things. The team began setting up camp near the landing site, pitching solar-powered shelters and unpacking tools. Amara busied herself with organizing sample containers, grateful for the distraction. Still, every time she glanced around, the vast emptiness seemed to mock her. Where were the vibrant ecosystems she'd dreamed of studying? The thriving biodiversity she'd spent years preparing to document. By midday, the sun blazed overhead, turning the desert into an oven. Sweat trickled down Amara's neck despite her cooling suit, and her throat felt parched even though she sipped water regularly. As she knelt to collect a soil sample, her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the surface. Curious, she dug deeper, revealing a shard of glassy material embedded in the sand. It shimmered faintly, catching the sunlight in strange ways. "What's this?" she muttered, holding it up for closer inspection. Before she could examine it further, a loud crack echoed across the dunes. Everyone froze. One of the portable scanners had overheated and exploded, sending fragments flying. No one was hurt, but the incident left the group rattled. "This place doesn't play nice," Elias said grimly, inspecting the damaged device. "It'll test you in ways you can't imagine." Amara gripped the shard tightly, feeling its rough edges press into her palm. For the first time, doubt crept into her mind. If Earth wasn't the paradise she'd imagined, then what exactly was it? And more importantly, could she survive long enough to find out? As twilight fell and the temperature plummeted, Amara stared up at the star-filled sky. The beauty above contrasted sharply with the harshness below. Somewhere in that contradiction lay answers and challenges she hadn't anticipated. The glowing rings of shards surrounding the camp grew brighter as night deepened, their faint hum resonating through the air like a distant choir. The team huddled together near the central shelter, their flashlights casting shaky beams into the darkness. No one spoke for several minutes, each person lost in their own thoughts or fears. "What do we do?" Zara finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that betrayed her unease. Elias glanced around at the group, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the crystals. "We wait," he said firmly, "and observe. If this is some kind of phenomenon, we need to understand it before we act." Amara nodded, though her mind raced with questions. Were the crystals trying to communicate? Or were they warning the team to leave? She couldn't shake the feeling that the desert had been patient so far, but patience had its limits. As the hours passed, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and making it hard to think clearly. Some members of the team began pacing nervously, while others sat silently, staring at the pulsing lights. Amara noticed one scientist, Dr. Ravi Patel, scribbling furiously in his notebook, muttering calculations under his breath. "This isn't natural," he said suddenly, looking up from his notes. "These vibrations, they're not random. They're harmonic frequencies, similar to patterns found in human brainwaves." The group turned to him, startled. "You mean they're alive?" Another member asked, his voice trembling. "Not necessarily alive in the way we understand it," Ravi clarified. "But sentient, possibly. These crystals might be a form of communication, an attempt to interact with us." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't shared her earlier vision with the team, fearing they'd dismiss her as irrational. But now, hearing Ravi's analysis, she wondered if the images she'd seen weren't just a trick of the mind. Maybe the desert was showing her something real, a glimpse of Earth's past and future. Before anyone could respond further, the ground beneath them trembled violently. Everyone stumbled, grabbing onto whatever they could to stay upright. The hum escalated into a deafening roar, and the glowing rings flared brightly, almost blinding. "Get back!" Elias shouted, waving everyone toward the shelter. But it was too late. Sand erupted around the edges of the camp, swallowing equipment whole. Tools flew into the air, tossed by invisible forces. One scientist screamed as a shard shot out of the ground mere inches from his foot. Chaos reigned as the team scrambled to escape the growing maelstrom. Amara ducked behind a collapsed scanner, shielding her face from flying debris. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. The desert wasn't just testing them anymore, it was attacking. Through the chaos, she spotted Zora crouched nearby, holding onto a metal rod for balance. Their eyes met, and without speaking, they both understood what needed to be done. Amara grabbed her pack and slung it over her shoulder, then motioned for Zara to follow her. Together, they crawled toward the edge of the disturbance, avoiding the swirling sand and jagged shards. When they reached safer ground, Amara pulled out the shard she'd kept from the previous day. It pulsed faintly in her hand, its rhythm matching the vibrations still echoing through the desert. She held it up, hoping, praying, that it might calm whatever force was raging around them. To her astonishment, the storm began to subside. The roaring faded, the trembling stopped, and the glowing rings dimmed until they disappeared entirely. Silence returned to the desert, broken only by the sound of the wind. The rest of the team emerged cautiously from the shelter, their faces pale and streaked with sweat. "What just happened?" someone whispered. Amara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the shard in her hand, her mind racing. The desert had spared them, for now, but she knew it wouldn't be so forgiving next time. "We underestimated this place," Elias said grimly, surveying the damage. "It's not just a landscape, it's alive, and it doesn't trust us." Amara clenched the shard tightly, determination replacing her fear. If the desert wanted to test them, she would rise to the challenge. But first, she needed answers, and she wasn't leaving until she found them. The next morning, Amara and Zora approached Elias cautiously, pulling him aside while the rest of the team worked on salvaging what remained of their equipment. They explained their suspicions about Marcus, his nervous behavior, his insistence on leaving, and the possibility that corporate interests were driving the mission. At first, Elias listened skeptically, his arms crossed over his chest. But when Amara mentioned overhearing Marcus's cryptic remarks about exploiting the desert, Elias's expression darkened. "We need to act carefully," he said after a long pause. "If Marcus is working for someone else, we can't confront him directly. Not yet. Let's gather evidence first." Amara nodded, grateful for his support. Together, the three of them decided to monitor Marcus closely, watching for any suspicious activity. Later that day, as the team regrouped to assess their progress, tensions flared once again. Marcus argued loudly that repairing the comms array should be their top priority, dismissing further study of the crystals as a waste of time. "These shards are just rocks," he snapped, gesturing angrily at the glowing formations scattered around the camp. We're scientists, not mystics chasing fairy tales. Amara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. They're not just rocks, Marcus. You saw what happened last night. The storm, the vibrations. This place reacts to us. Ignoring it won't make it go away. Marcus glared at her, his face reddening. And what do you propose? Sitting here playing with your shiny trinkets while we wait for another disaster. Before Amara could respond, Elias intervened. Enough. We'll split into 2 teams. One will focus on the crystals. The other will work on the comms array. That way, no one feels sidelined. Though reluctant, Marcus agreed, likely hoping to use the distraction to advance his own agenda. Amara watched him closely as he joined the group working on the comms array, noting how often he glanced toward the glowing shards with thinly veiled disdain. As the day wore on, Amara and Zara ventured deeper into the desert, searching for more clusters of crystals. Their goal was twofold: to learn more about the strange formations and to keep an eye out for anything unusual Marcus might be hiding. Hours later, they stumbled upon something extraordinary, a massive cavern hidden beneath a collapsed dune. Inside, towering crystal structures rose like ancient trees, their surfaces shimmering with intricate patterns that pulsed in unison. This changes everything," Zara whispered, awe evident in her voice. Amara nodded, her heart racing. She reached out tentatively to touch one of the crystals, half expecting another vision. Instead, the hum grew louder, resonating through the cavern like a symphony. Suddenly, shouts echoed from outside the cave. "They found us," Zara said urgently, grabbing Amara's arm. Rushing back to the surface, they discovered Marcus leading a small group toward the cavern, carrying tools designed for extraction. "What are you doing?" Amara demanded, stepping between them and the entrance. "Finishing this mission," Marcus replied coldly. "These crystals are valuable. If we don't take them, someone else will." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Amara shouted, panic rising in her chest. But Marcus ignored her, motioning for his team to proceed. As they began drilling into the largest crystal formation, the ground trembled violently. The hum escalated into a deafening roar, and the crystals inside the cavern lit up with blinding intensity. Sand erupted around them, swallowing Marcus and his team whole. Amara and Zara barely escaped, stumbling backward as the desert unleashed its fury once more. When the chaos subsided, the cavern, and everyone inside it, was gone, buried beneath tons of shifting sand. Breathing heavily, Amara turned to Zara. "The desert doesn't forgive betrayal," she murmured. For the first time, fear flickered in Zara's eyes. "What do we do now?" Amara clenched her fists, resolve hardening within her. "We protect what's left, and we find a way to make peace with the desert and with ourselves." The loss of Marcus and his team weighed heavily on everyone. The survivors gathered in stunned silence near the edge of the newly formed sand mound that now concealed the cavern, and those who had dared to defy the desert's will. Amara stood apart from the group, her hands trembling as she clutched the shard she'd carried since the beginning. Guilt gnawed at her, not because she felt responsible for what had happened, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that the disaster could have been avoided if they'd understood the crystals sooner. Elias broke the somber quiet first, his voice low but steady. "This is our fault. We came here thinking we could control this place, exploit it for our own gain. But Earth doesn't work like that anymore. It's alive, and it demands respect." Amara nodded slowly, her mind racing. Respect, was that all the desert wanted? Or was there something deeper, something more complex beneath its surface? She glanced at the glowing shards scattered around the camp, their faint pulses almost soothing compared to the chaos of the past few days. "We need to try again," she said finally, stepping forward. "Not to fight it or take from it, but to listen." Zara frowned, crossing her arms. "How? That thing just swallowed half our team whole." "Because we didn't understand," Amara replied firmly. "We treated it like a resource instead of an ecosystem, maybe even a living being. If we can communicate properly, if we show it we're willing to learn, it might stop seeing us as a threat. Elias studied her for a moment, then sighed. It's risky, but staying here without trying is riskier. What do you propose? Amara hesitated, unsure how much to share about the visions she'd experienced. Instead, she focused on what she knew for certain. The crystals responded to touch, vibration, and intent. Drawing inspiration from Dr. Patel's earlier observations about harmonic frequencies, she suggested building a device capable of mimicking the crystal's natural rhythms. I think I can do it, Zara offered after a pause. If we used parts from the damaged equipment, I can rig something together. With nothing left to lose, the remaining team members worked tirelessly through the night. Amara guided Zara on calibrating the device to match the crystal's pulse patterns, while Elias helped gather energy sources from the wreckage. By dawn, they had constructed a crude but functional apparatus, a circular frame lined with sensors and small speakers designed to emit low-frequency vibrations. When the sun rose, casting long shadows across the dunes, Amara carried the device to the center of camp. Everyone watched anxiously as she activated it. At first, nothing happened. Then, faintly, the ground began to hum in response. The nearby shards glowed brighter, their light spreading outward in gentle waves. It's working, Zara whispered, her voice tinged with awe. Encouraged, Amara knelt beside one of the larger shards and placed her hand on its surface. This time, the vision came immediately, but it wasn't chaotic or overwhelming. She saw images of Earth healing itself, barren lands sprouting green shoots, rivers flowing once more, skies clearing to reveal stars. And amidst it all, the crystals stood tall, acting as anchors for life to return. When the vision faded, Amara opened her eyes to find the entire team staring at her expectantly. The desert isn't punishing us, she said softly. It's protecting itself and offering a chance to heal, but only if we leave peacefully and let it regenerate. Elias nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. We'll dismantle everything we brought and leave no trace behind. As the team set to work packing up their gear, Amara stayed behind briefly. She pressed her palm against the largest shard one last time, leaving behind a silent promise. Someday, she would return, not to take, but to give back. The desert seemed to respond, its glow dimming gently as if acknowledging her vow. For the first time since arriving, Amara felt a flicker of hope. Earth wasn't lost, it was waiting for humanity to prove it deserved another chance. The aftermath of the desert's fury left the team shaken but alive. Equipment lay scattered and buried beneath mounds of sand, some pieces irreparably damaged. The shelter had partially collapsed, leaving them exposed to the elements. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air, yet no one dared rest, not after what they'd just witnessed. Amara sat cross-legged on the ground, the shard still clutched tightly in her hand. Its faint glow had dimmed since the storm subsided, but it continued to pulse rhythmically, as if reminding her of its presence. Around her, the team argued heatedly about what to do next. "We can't stay here," Dr. Patel shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "This place is dangerous. It's not worth risking our lives for data. And where would we go?" Zara snapped back, gesturing toward the endless dunes. "We're stranded until we fix the comms array. Running won't solve anything." Elias stood quietly at the edge of the group, observing the chaos with a furrowed brow. He hadn't spoken much since the attack, but his silence carried weight. When he finally stepped forward, the arguing voices quieted. "Blaming each other won't help," he said firmly. "What matters now is survival, and understanding why this happened. Amara, you've been closest to these crystals. Do you have any insights?" All eyes turned to her. Amara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She knew the truth might sound far-fetched, but keeping silent wasn't an option anymore. "The crystals aren't just minerals," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. They're connected to each other, to the desert, maybe even to us. When I touched one yesterday, I saw visions of Earth's past, its collapse, and something else, like a warning. A tense silence followed. Some members exchanged skeptical glances, while others looked intrigued or frightened. "So you're saying they're sentient?" Zara asked, crossing her arms. "I don't know if sentient is the right word," Amara admitted, "but they're responding to us, maybe testing us, or trying to tell us something." Before anyone could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "This is ridiculous," muttered Dr. Marcus Hale, the team's geologist. "Crystals don't think. They don't feel. This is all speculation based on gut feelings and superstition." His words ignited fresh arguments. Some sided with Marcus, dismissing Amara's claims as fantasy. Others defended her, pointing out that the evidence couldn't be ignored. Tensions escalated until Elias raised his hand, silencing the group once more. "Enough," he said sharply. "Arguing won't change the facts. Whether or not the crystals are sentient, they've already proven they can affect us. We need to decide. Do we continue studying them, or do we abandon this mission entirely?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Slowly, the group split into factions. Marcus led those who wanted to leave, insisting their primary goal should be repairing the comms array and calling for extraction. Amara found herself standing with Zara and a few others who believed staying was their only chance to uncover the truth. As the debate raged on, Amara noticed something odd. Marcus kept glancing nervously at the horizon, as if expecting trouble. Suspicion flickered in her mind. Why was he so eager to leave? Was there more to his insistence than met the eye? Later that evening, as the group prepared to sleep fitfully under makeshift covers, Amara approached Zara near the edge of camp. "I think Marcus knows something," Amara whispered, keeping her voice low. Zara frowned. "Like what?" "I'm not sure yet, but I overheard him talking earlier. He mentioned corporate interests funding this mission. What if they sent us here not to study the desert, but to exploit it?" Zara's eyes widened. "You think he sabotaged the equipment?" "It makes sense," Amara replied grimly. "If someone wanted to force us out before we discovered too much." They shared a long look, both realizing the implications. If Marcus was working against them, the stakes were higher than ever. "We need proof," Zara said finally. "And allies. Can we trust anyone else?" Amara nodded. "Let's start with Elias. He's listened to me so far. Maybe he'll believe us." Under the cover of darkness, the two women devised a plan. They wouldn't let fear or greed dictate their fate, not when the desert itself seemed to demand answers. Whatever secrets lay hidden beneath the sands, Amara vowed to uncover them, even if it meant taking on her own team. The first night in the Sahara expanse was colder than Amara had imagined. The scorching heat of the day gave way to biting winds that howled across the dunes, rattling the thin walls of their temporary shelters. She lay awake on her cot, staring at the ceiling as the wind moaned like a living thing. It wasn't just the cold keeping her up. It was the weight of everything she'd seen so far. The endless sand, the broken equipment, and that strange shard she'd found earlier. What asterisk was asterisked? And why did it feel so unnatural? Morning came too soon, bringing with it another wave of blistering heat. The team gathered around a small table outside their main shelter, sipping lukewarm water and reviewing their plans for the day. Dr. Elias Cade stood at the head of the group, his expression unreadable behind his visor. "We need to focus," he said, his voice firm. "The scanners are down, but we can still collect samples manually. Stick together. No one goes out alone." Amara nodded along with the others, though her mind kept drifting back to the shard. She tucked it into her pack last night, unable to shake the feeling that it might be important. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here, or at least, not in the Earth she'd learned about in textbooks. After breakfast, the team split into pairs to explore different sections of the desert. Amara was paired with Zara, a no-nonsense engineer who rarely spoke unless necessary. They trudged through the sand, scanning the ground for anything unusual. At first, there was nothing but more emptiness. Then, about an hour in, Zara stopped abruptly. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the ground. Amara crouched beside her, brushing away loose sand to reveal another cluster of those glassy shards. These were larger, almost forming a jagged circle beneath the surface. They glimmered faintly, even in the harsh sunlight. "What do you think they are?" Amara asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Zara shrugged. "Could be some kind of mineral deposit, or maybe debris from old satellites. Either way, we should report it." But before Amara could respond, something shifted underfoot. The ground trembled slightly, and both women stumbled backward. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through their boots and up their legs. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "What the hell is that?" Zara muttered, glancing around nervously. Amara didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the shards, which now pulsed faintly with light. Each pulse matched the rhythm of the humming, as if the two were connected. For a moment, she thought she saw shadows moving between the dunes, though when she blinked, they were gone. "We should go," Zara said firmly, grabbing Amara's arm. "Now." Reluctantly, Amara let herself be pulled away, but she couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder. The shards stayed behind, glowing softly against the golden sand. Back at camp, the rest of the team listened skeptically as Amara described what she'd seen. Some dismissed it as stress or exhaustion. Others suggested it might be a natural phenomenon caused by underground gases. Only Elias seemed genuinely interested, though he warned her not to get carried away. "This desert will mess with your head if you let it," he said. "Stay focused. Stay safe." That night, Amara sat alone near the edge of camp, staring out at the darkened dunes. Despite Elias's warning, she couldn't stop thinking about the shards and the strange feelings they stirred inside her. Was the desert truly alive, as some ancient myths claimed, or was it just playing tricks on them, testing their resolve? As sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of the shards glowing brighter and brighter, until the entire desert lit up like a starry sky. The next morning, Amara woke with a start, her heart pounding as fragments of her dream lingered in her mind. The glowing shards had filled her thoughts all night, their rhythmic pulses echoing like a heartbeat. She shook her head, trying to clear the image, but it was no use. Something about those shards felt alive, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Determined to uncover the truth, Amara decided to revisit the site where she and Zara had found the cluster. She waited until the rest of the team was occupied with their tasks, Elias cataloging soil samples, others repairing damaged equipment, and slipped away quietly. The desert stretched endlessly before her, its silence almost oppressive. Her boots sank slightly into the soft sand with each step, and the heat pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. But she pushed forward, driven by an unshakable curiosity. When she reached the spot, the shards were still there, embedded in the ground just as they'd been the day before. This time, though, they seemed brighter, their faint glow pulsing more steadily. Kneeling beside them, Amara brushed away the sand carefully, revealing even more of the strange formations. They weren't random or chaotic. They formed intricate patterns, almost geometric, as if they'd been arranged deliberately. "What are you?" she whispered aloud, her voice barely audible over the wind. As if in response, the hum returned, the same low vibration she'd felt earlier. It started softly, then grew stronger, resonating through her body. Amara froze, unsure whether to stay or run. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Slowly, she reached out and touched one of the shards. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt shot through her arm, not painful, but startling. Images flooded her mind, vivid and overwhelming. She saw flashes of Earth's past, lush green forests, rivers teeming with life, skies painted in hues of orange and pink during sunset. Then the vision shifted, showing barren wastelands, cities crumbling into dust, and flames consuming everything in sight. Amara gasped, pulling her hand back instinctively. Her breath came in short bursts as she tried to make sense of what she'd just experienced. Was it real? Or had the heat finally gotten to her? Before she could process further, movement caught her eye. Shadows flickered across the dunes, shifting unnaturally against the sunlight. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her, but then she noticed the shadows didn't match anything around her. They twisted and curled like living things, moving toward her with deliberate intent. "Amara," a voice called from behind. She turned to see Zora approaching quickly, her expression tense. "What are you doing out here alone? Elias is looking for you." Amara hesitated, glancing back at the shards. The shadows had vanished, leaving only the harsh glare of the sun. Had she imagined them? Zara followed her gaze and frowned. "Are these the crystals you were talking about? Let's go. You shouldn't be here by yourself." Reluctantly, Amara stood up, brushing sand off her gloves. As they walked back to camp, she debated whether to tell Zara about the visions. Would she believe her, or would she dismiss it as nonsense, like everyone else? Back at camp, the team gathered for a quick meeting. Amara shared what she'd seen, describing the glowing shards and the patterns they formed. Some members listened skeptically, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "They're probably just mineral deposits reacting to heat," one scientist suggested. "No," Elias interrupted, his tone serious. "This desert isn't ordinary. We've barely scratched the surface of what's out here. If Amara says the shards are behaving strangely, we need to take her seriously." His words surprised her. For the first time since arriving, someone believed her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the entire team noticed something unusual. Around their camp, small clusters of the glowing shards began appearing in the sand, forming rings that surrounded them. They pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the dunes. "It's watching us," Zora murmured, breaking the silence. Amara nodded, her earlier fear replaced by awe. The desert wasn't just testing them, it was communicating, and she intended to listen.